The SpongeBob SquarePants movie marks an important time in Nickelodeon's history. If you ask many fans, they'll tell you this is where classic SpongeBob ended. But as far as Nickelodeon was concerned, SpongeBob was just getting started. The film grossed $85.4 million at the US domestic box office, which wasn't quite to the level of the first Rugrats movie, but it was still impressive enough that it's the 7th highest grossing Nick film to this day. This was actually a pivotal result for Nickelodeon in my opinion. Before the SpongeBob movie, Nick shows had been doing poorly at the box office. Wild Thornberrys, Rugrats Go Wild, and Hey Arnold all performed poorly, so SpongeBob being such a big hit secured its place as Nickelodeon's cash cow. And if you ask Nickelodeon video game fans, many of them would say the SpongeBob movie marked the last truly great original solo SpongeBob game. Depending on where you look, the home console version was actually received better by critics than Battle for Bikini Bottom. Will the SpongeBob movie be able to live up to that hype? My name's Brandon and this is Nickelodeon Video Game History, a show where I take a look back on all of the video games based on Nickelodeon shows and retrospectively review them. Like I said, the SpongeBob movie was a pivotal time in Nickelodeon's overall history. The channel was searching for that next mega hit. They knew SpongeBob was popular by this point, but could it replace Rugrats, which was a true pop culture icon? Well, the film certainly answered that question. It reviewed surprisingly well with critics, a rarity for films based on TV shows, and it grossed $140 million worldwide, which puts it on par with the Rugrats movie. So while Rugrats proved to be slightly more popular in the US, it was clear SpongeBob was a worldwide hit. To the surprise of nobody, the film was to receive tie-in games. On April 7, 2004, THQ announced its slate of Nickelodeon games for the year, with the SpongeBob movie being amongst them. Here they also announced Freeze Frame Frenzy, Shadow Showdown, and Attack of the Twonkies. The game would eventually burst onto the scene on October 27, roughly 3 weeks before the film's premiere, hitting the GBA, home consoles, PC, and it even got a Java mobile version. Those of you in the know will be aware of this game's status as a spiritual sequel to Battle for Bikini Bottom when it comes to the home console version, and that's because Heavy Iron Studios was brought back by THQ. Clearly they were impressed with their first game. In my Battle for Bikini Bottom review, I talked a bit about their backstory, so I'll try and keep this brief. They burst onto the scene in 2000 and immediately established themselves as one of the better licensed game studios. Scooby-Doo Night of 100 Frights was only their second game, yet it managed to average a 7 out of 10 from critics, no easy task for a licensed game at the time. That was then immediately followed up by Battle for Bikini Bottom, so yeah, they had a hot start. They managed to grab the attention of Disney, who started using them for most of their games in the mid to late 2000s. The Incredibles came out literally one day after the SpongeBob movie, and they'd go on to make Rise of the Underminer, Ratatouille, WALL-E, and Up. Eventually they returned to SpongeBob with the Truth or Square game, but since then they've mostly functioned as a support studio, probably because licensed AA games had fallen out of favour. They worked on a number of prominent Activision franchises like Call of Duty and Crash Bandicoot, but in 2020 they were snapped up by Keyword Studios, a video game conglomerate that has also snapped up other studios seen throughout Nickelodeon video game history, like High Voltage, Tantalus, and Climax Studios. On the GBA side of things, WayForward stepped up to the plate. I've covered some of their more recent games as part of Cartoon Network video game history, which mostly consisted of disappointing regular show and Adventure Time games. This was actually the first Nick game they developed, but in the future they returned for the handheld versions of Lights Camera Pants, Tack the Great Juju Challenge, Unfabulous, and Creature from the Krusty Krab, and they'd be the main studio in charge of SpongeBob SquigglePants and TMNT Danger of the Ooze. Something I wasn't aware of until doing research for this video is that there was actually a PlayStation 3 port at one point. On Feb 5, 2012, it was announced that the game would be released on the PlayStation Store as a PS2 classic in a couple days' time. This was a disaster. The port was slammed for numerous technical issues not present in the original, including severe input lag and sound delays during in-engine cutscenes, and the game actually defaulted to stretching the original 4:3 display to a 16:9 aspect ratio, which looked awful. The port was quietly removed from the store shortly after its release, with no explanation ever given. just THQ things. Critically, the GBA version did incredibly poor, flopping to a 5.3 average score, but like I said, the home console version was a hit. Across all three home console versions, the game managed a 7.4 average, which is genuinely impressive. The SpongeBob movie lives in the shadow of Battle for Bikini Bottom. Could this finally be the day it breaks out and gets the love critics in 2004 thought it deserved? Possibly the most appealing thing to me about the SpongeBob movie on GBA is that we finally got a pure handheld platformer. Pretty much all of the previous handheld ports of SpongeBob games were half 2D platformer, half mangled take on the Metroidvania genre. For me, none of those previous games hit the mark. Here, WayForward aren't trying to do anything other than stick to a singular genre, and to be honest, it works decently. You get thrown into a little overworld showing where SpongeBob and Patrick are on their journey, and once you dive into a proper level, you discover that SpongeBob and Patrick are paired together just like in the movie. Despite the pairing, you only really control SpongeBob. At first glance, it seems like you'd be switching on the fly between the two, harnessing each character's unique abilities. I think this is maybe a missed opportunity, but I've seen so many systems like this single-handedly derail a licensed game before, so I can't really complain about WayForward keeping it simple. Despite the simplicity of the game, SpongeBob and Patrick have a surprisingly large array of abilities. You've got your standard jump with A and run with B, but then you throw in a ground pound and a glide, which sees Patrick get full nude.
Where your clothes at?
They aren't game-changing abilities, but they're the extra spice needed to keep the game from being boring. The big issue with the SpongeBob movie is controls. For starters, jumping is as floaty as it comes. I instantly got the vibe that this was done to simulate the feeling of being underwater, which is still weird because SpongeBob characters don't exactly act like they're underwater. You never feel like the jumping is precise, so when you start bouncing off enemies' heads for extra boosts and that sort of thing, you don't exactly feel in control. It's not completely awful or game-breaking, but it's off by just enough to interrupt your enjoyment frequently. The other big issue I had was the way SpongeBob skids if you dare to change direction while running. This issue doesn't crop up too much, usually only becoming noticeable during tense enemy encounters or boss battles, but when it does happen, you'll be cursing the developers for making it a thing. It wouldn't be a true platformer without a smattering of weird objects to collect during levels, something this game doesn't hold back on. Firstly, you have gold clams. At first, they seem like the standard collect 100, get a 1-up collectible, but they're not. Instead, they're this game's currency. Similar to Tak 2, outside of levels you can head to an item shop, which is run by Mindy, and purchase things like lives. It's a handy inclusion, especially because I feel like this makes the game a lot more accessible to the young demographic of SpongeBob. The other collectible is buckets. Yeah, buckets. I was stumped by these at first, but I quickly discovered that it's ammo for one of two special moves available to the player. By holding R, you can charge up a battering ram that utilizes Patrick's big Chungus girth. This flies through basically all enemies, destroys some roadblocks, and it plays a pivotal role in a lot of levels. Pressing L sees SpongeBob expand and then explode a bunch of bubbles, destroying every enemy that's on the screen. Becomes pretty obvious why they used limited ammo for this when you witness how overpowered it can be. Buckets are one of the items you can purchase from Mindy, so you can stockpile them to cheese your way through any section, giving you a particularly hard time. Taking a page out of the classic Mario formula, grabbing a mustache grants you invincibility. These are integrated into the level's design in a pivotal way, generally being placed in sections that would be almost impossible to pass through without dying in your normal state. Overall, the gameplay on offer for the GBA's version of the SpongeBob movie is okay. It doesn't dare to stray outside of lines and do anything too risky, but it all works pretty well for the most part. If the jumping just felt normal, I wouldn't have much to complain about. The bones of this game are solid. The extra spice peppered throughout can be tiresome though. I'd be doing myself a disservice if I didn't shout out the paddy wagon and on-rails running levels. These stray ever so close to obligatory shmup section territory, but I'll give it a pass. These are boring and not fun at all. You simply need to survive for 60 seconds, with one of these being placed in every world. Then you've got the boss battles. No prizes for accurately guessing my opinion on these. They suck. But not in the typical, oh my god, these are painful to sit through way. Instead, they're so damn basic that they feel like a waste of time. At their core, you just need to bop the boss on their head 3 times. You've got to dodge their movements until they stop, something you'd be able to do in your sleep because they're so simple. I know this is focused on kids, but it really felt like these boss battles were placed here out of obligation. They pretty much always utilize an iconic villain from the movie, so it's a shame they didn't get more creative for these encounters. That might be for the best though, because I felt the wrath of some pretty silly glitches during these sections. The first came during a boss battle with Dennis, where I would instantly die when the boss battle started. It was both infuriating and hilarious. Then the finale of the game thought they'd go one better, and decided to murder SpongeBob and Patrick during a cutscene. In the final boss battle, Plankton interrupts the chaos to talk to you, and for some reason I just died. This happened multiple times until one time it just didn't. Very strange behaviour, but also more evidence towards these just being shoehorned in. As you'd probably expect, this game uses a bunch of screenshots from the film to tell its story. However, it's not entirely straightforward. The screenshots look like they've been remade in some cases, while in others it looks like a hybrid of game graphics and the film. It can be pretty bizarre, but look, it's a GBA game, so I wasn't expecting an amazing retelling of the film's story anyway. The actual in-game visuals are really solid. I like SpongeBob and Patrick's sprites, and they have a nice fluidity to their movement, but their running animations look goofy as shit. And then you've got some oddly sexual sound effects from the game's characters. No! Where this game really stumbles is the level design. The first issue stems from the source material. In my opinion, the SpongeBob movie doesn't have enough unique locations to carry a game with this many worlds. This isn't a particularly long game, but even with 6 worlds made up of 4 levels, it felt like I was running through so many generic settings. The start is particularly bad. I went through the first 2 worlds and the only interesting level was the brief encounter in the Thug Tug. Ah yes, it's my favourite location from the SpongeBob movie, desert. Again, I don't think this is really the fault of Way Forward. They could only work with what they had, and I think the movie this is based on doesn't really lend itself too well to a video game retelling. To keep things from being a strict A to B platformer, they borrow some gimmicks seen in other platformers, like constantly falling ceilings that are trying to crush you. Some of these gimmicks work okay, but most of them are just tedious. My least favourite was the wind gimmick. In World 4, you have to put up with a massive gust of wind that picks up every few seconds, pushing you back until it stops. It doesn't make the level challenging or even particularly special and memorable. Instead, you're just pausing constantly, waiting for the game to let you continue on. A gimmick like this strips the game of any fun, especially when they dedicate basically an entire world's worth of levels to it. They follow this up with World 5 immediately, which is set at Shell City. Because Shell City is out of the water, these levels have a gimmick where SpongeBob and Patrick are constantly on the brink of death and need to activate the sprinkler system repeatedly to make it to the end. Again, it's just not fun to play. It's a genuine slog, and dedicating entire worlds to this stuff is just plain cruel. I could maybe stomach these kinds of gimmicks for a single level, but instead 2 entire worlds back to back were thoroughly unenjoyable. It essentially completely ruined my enjoyment of the game. The only acceptable level gimmick is the one where you're running on David Hasselhoff, and that's only because you can ground pound on that Hasselhoff ass. I think I'm being so harsh on these gimmick levels because the normal levels can be really good. Almost all of them stray from linear design, offering numerous branching paths that could be a shortcut or lead you to a 1-up or extra bucket ammo. Despite these paths, levels always felt fluid, and no matter which road I took, it just felt right. It's not perfect though. Some levels do end in like a minute, which was always a bit of a shock and gave me the impression that Way Forward were given a very short amount of time to put this together. I have to say, the SpongeBob movie isn't too bad. It's a decent little 2D platformer, and you could certainly do a lot worse on the GBA. Hell, just throw a dart at basically any game I've reviewed in the past year, and you could probably find a game trying to achieve something similar, but way worse. If the platforming was tweaked a little and some of the gimmicks were culled, I could have seen this being an underrated gem of the GBA. It doesn't quite hit that mark, but if you're a fan of SpongeBob, you'll have fun here, certainly in comparison to all of the other handheld SpongeBob games I've played so far. The SpongeBob movie on home consoles makes such a good first impression on players, particularly if you've played Battle for Bikini Bottom before. Each of the opening levels really feel like more polished versions of something you'd see in the previous game, with a number of things really being refined here. Being based on a film, the developers were obviously put on a ridiculously truncated development timeline, which results in some concessions being made here and there. But despite that, I genuinely felt like this was the better game, at least for the opening couple of hours. Unfortunately, the first impression the SpongeBob movie makes is a little too good, because once you get in a little deeper, you find a deeply flawed game that falters in far too many areas. One of the biggest reasons why this game starts off strongly is because it is such a faithful sequel to Battle for Bikini Bottom, both in design and in the basic controls. Platforming and controlling the characters feels so fluid and arguably better than the original game. Heavy Iron clearly had a great grasp on how to make a 3D platformer that feels comfortable. I also need to give them props for the tutorial level here. It's legitimately one of the most well-crafted tutorials I've ever played. It teaches you every single one of the game's basic controls and abilities, as well as introducing how levels will be structured without ever having to directly tell you all of this. Everything in the tutorial is laid out perfectly to ease players in and have them understand the game almost instantly. It's a masterclass in design. A strong theme throughout the SpongeBob movie is Battle for Bikini Bottom, but slightly different, which is instantly seen in the game's collectibles. The first place you come across this is in the game's version of the shiny objects. They're the collectible you're grabbing every time you smash a box or kill an enemy. In Battle for Bikini Bottom, these acted as a currency, gating off certain areas until you had enough to progress, but in the SpongeBob movie, they're experience points. Once you hit a certain target, you'll get a skill point, which you can sink into either SpongeBob or Patrick, upgrading health or the strength of the various abilities they gain throughout the adventure. There are also apparently called manliness points, which I don't think is ever brought up during the game, and they're shaped like dumbbells, which is weird, but considering the previous game just called them shiny objects, it's actually a step up. Every time you get a new skill point, the game lets you know on screen with this P icon. I guess the P stands for point? I don't know, Heavy Iron seems to be so random with their design choices around this stuff. Push a P. Under the hood, the SpongeBob movie has an anti-grinding mechanic for manliness points. Grinding was a thing you could do in Battle for Bikini Bottom, although in my experience platinuming Rehydrated, I never really found it necessary. How this mechanic works is that the longer the player stays in a level, the lower amount of manliness points they receive from boxes, enemies, and combos, until eventually all boxes and enemies are just giving you like 1 point. This mechanic persists even if the player leaves the level and returns. Naturally, it doesn't affect manliness points that are just sort of scattered throughout the levels. Honestly, it seems weird to me that they were so keen to crack down on grinding. I guess it could have broken the game a bit here because their use is making the player stronger, rather than removing a roadblock. Playing through the SpongeBob movie, I found that I was upgrading my skills so quickly that they shouldn't have even bothered with this anti-grinding effect. I was getting multiple upgrades per level most of the time, and to me it felt like the system was designed to have the player be fully upgraded before they reach the end of the game, kinda making the grinding stuff pointless. Replacing gold spatulas are the very fitting Goofy Goober tokens.
I'm sorry, SpongeBob. You don't have enough Goofy Goober tokens,
which can be used to unlock new moves at certain points in the game. Most of the abilities from Battle for Bikini Bottom return, including the spawn of Satan itself, the Sponge Bowl. I'll give a lot of credit to Heavy Iron though. They brought back the worst ability, but it's been majorly improved. It's still not amazing, but aiming it feels so much better. In my opinion, Rehydrated should have plucked the SpongeBob controls from this game. It would have made the remake close to perfect. But on the flip side, Patrick's ground pound ability just felt way worse here. I don't know why, but I found myself constantly accidentally activating this while Patrick was in the middle of a jump, which isn't something I ever experienced on my 2 Battle for Bikini Bottom playthroughs. No idea whether this was a me issue and I'd suddenly sprouted fat fingers, or it was something subtle that had changed about the controls. One of the biggest additions to the gameplay is the inclusion of different challenge sections. Like Battle for Bikini Bottom, different missions exist within singular levels, resulting in plenty of opportunities to grab Goofy Goober tokens.
I'm sorry, SpongeBob. You don't have enough Goofy Goober tokens.
You've got combat challenges where you need to dispatch 3 waves of enemies, and SpongeBob challenges where the SpongeBob ability returns, but takes you through a tough course that really wasn't seen in the previous game. Lastly, you've got the platforming challenges, which feel like they were inspired by the same kinds of sections in Mario Sunshine. Just like Mario Sunshine, these can be fucking infuriating, but despite the sometimes intense difficulty, all of these challenge sections are much more interesting than the kind of gameplay Heavy Iron decided to feature heavily in grinding tokens. Much like Battle for Bikini Bottom, the SpongeBob movie has a number of sliding sections, both as small sections inside of levels, and then entire levels dedicated to this gameplay. Battle for Bikini Bottom had a couple of levels dedicated to this, but here it's a massive overkill. Compounding this issue is the Paddy Wagon. It wouldn't be a SpongeBob movie game without this iconic vehicle, but the implementation is a huge mess. The Paddy Wagon driving levels are just so awkward. The first time you go through this level, in most cases, you're just casually driving along with no real urgency. You're not in danger of dying or anything, so the level plays out as a more boring, flatter version of a regular level. Because the Paddy Wagon handles so heavily, you need to drive at the speed of crawl to actually smash boxes and get manliness points. They pepper in nitro power-ups that give you a speed boost when activated, and strangely, the Paddy Wagon controls a lot better when it's in this mode. When you complete this initial drive-through of the Paddy Wagon levels, the game immediately kicks you to the next world. You can return to these worlds to do extra challenges later on to get more Goofy Goober tokens.
I'm sorry, SpongeBob. You don't have enough Goofy Goober tokens.
But it feels super weird that they didn't lump any of these challenges into the initial portion. It feels at odds with the other platforming levels, some of which allow you to get half a dozen tokens in a single run. The additional missions for tokens in the sliding and Paddy Wagon levels are so tiresome too. They're overly long and have significant penalties for failing them. Some of these missions take minutes and minutes to get through, and failing towards the end only to boringly sit through the same mission again is not fun. I would say sliding and driving is like half the game here, not even exaggerating, which I absolutely hated. The levels aren't nearly fun enough to be such a significant part. In my opinion, these sections should have been relegated to smaller challenge areas of the platforming levels, just like the combat or SpongeBob sections are. Obviously, we've got boss battles here. I found Battle for Bikini Bottoms to be very tedious, but here Heavy Iron have replaced those with fights that are laughably basic, just like the handheld version. The theme here is that each fight has you repeating the same thing over and over again as you drain the boss's health bar. They have a singular short movement pattern. Avoid that briefly, they'll leave themselves open, and then you take a chunk of their health with whatever that battle's gimmick is. As the internet's #1 boss battle hater, I will say that I prefer these boss battles to what Battle for Bikini Bottom had. If your fights are going to suck, at least make them easy and brief. One of the more significant tweaks to the Battle for Bikini Bottom formula is the level design. Even going back to Revenge of the Flying Dutchman, these home console SpongeBob games in the PS2 era had a sort of Mario 64 level design where you had a bunch of missions in a singular open level. But what I loved is that you could get a bunch of spatulas in one run, whereas Mario 64 has you entering and exiting the level constantly, something they fixed with Odyssey. It's part of the reason why I hate the driving and sliding levels, and while the SpongeBob movie does kind of retain this design philosophy in its platforming levels, it's just a bit off. Levels are much more linear here and way smaller in scope. Yeah, I'm still able to get a bunch of Goofy Goober tokens.
I'm sorry, SpongeBob. You don't have enough Goofy Goober tokens.
But it feels like they're all being given to me on a linear path, rather than me venturing off and finding unique areas. The areas that do branch off the golden path are usually so small that it loses the sense of exploration and discovery in Battle for Bikini Bottom. I think this all comes down to this game being based on a film. I would be surprised if the development time for the SpongeBob movie was anything close to Battle for Bikini Bottom. Heavy Iron was also developing the Incredibles game at the same time, so it's little surprise this title turned out to be a little unambitious. And these quirks in the game's development cycle result in very poorly implemented segments. One of my biggest issues was with the level where Patrick's throwing ability is reintroduced. Heavy Iron makes throwing a pivotal part of the combat here. So many enemies can really only be defeated with a throw. But these enemies also take multiple hits to die, so usually this results in you having to run back and forth from watermelon spawn points to kill these enemies. The biggest issue with the SpongeBob movie though is its obsession with roadblocking and gatekeeping. Battle for Bikini Bottom did this by locking certain things behind golden spatulas and shiny objects, but it was nowhere near as frequent as this. I hit my first roadblock in the trench level. Mindy told me I didn't have enough Goofy Goober tokens. To learn a new move that was required to complete the level. Once you hit your first roadblock in this game, you will keep hitting them over and over again. It ends up feeling like you hit a roadblock every time you come to a new platforming level. The one saving grace of this is the fast travel system. Instead of just warping you from level to level, Heavy Iron allows you to teleport straight to a mission. This makes grinding out tokens a little more tolerable. Having to go through entire levels for this would have been pure misery. I just don't understand Heavy Iron's obsession with this kind of structure. There's nothing like being ready to head to the climax of the game, only to have Mindy tell you to grind more Goofy Goober tokens. The game also gives you a more subtle roadblock during Patrick's throwing level, where you can't progress without upgrading Patrick's ground pound ability. You need to be able to stun enemies with this, which then allows them to be thrown. The game makes zero mention or hint at this requirement. They give you complete flexibility to upgrade whatever you want in this game, so if you hadn't upgraded that specific ability, you're stuck grinding manliness points. That's if you figured out that upgrading the ground pound is the solution to your problem. Alright, let's pump the brakes on the negativity. The SpongeBob movie is a real step up from Battle for Bikini Bottom in the presentation area. I think this is actually an added benefit of this game being a sequel. Most of the big ticket mechanics were created for the previous game, allowing Heavy Iron to spend more time on things like visuals. This is partly why this game isn't a massive disaster. Movie tie-in games were made on insane timelines, but because Heavy Iron had already laid the game's foundation previously, it was never going to turn out abysmally. It's not all smooth sailing though, because the cutscenes are kind of weird. They do this strange thing where they'll use screenshots from the film with the French narrator talking over them, but then a lot of the time they'll cut from that to an in-engine cutscene that depicts exactly the same thing. But without this, we wouldn't have gotten the abomination that is fake Hasselhoff. Oh, and the voice cast is superb. Basically everybody reprised their role except Alec Baldwin as Dennis. Yes, this means Scarlett Johansson recorded lines for a damn SpongeBob game.
The last of Plankton's propaganda towers are here on the edge of the desert.
Based on my tweet that went viral, a lot of people didn't even realize ScarJo voiced Mindy in the movie, let alone the video game adaptation. Crazy to think one of the biggest movie stars on the planet was doing this. I can genuinely see why this game was so revered by critics at the time of review. As far as 2004 standards go, the SpongeBob Movie game is basically the Citizen Kane of movie tie-ins. This had so much potential, but Heavy Iron couldn't curb some of their worst tendencies, and I'm sure the truncated development cycle didn't help either. The more I played the game, the less I liked it. It's just perfectly summed up by a single word: tedious. The roadblocks are so damn tedious, and the fact that getting past them requires you to spend so much time with the sliding and paddy wagon makes it all the more frustrating. The Goofy Goober token requirements killed the game for me. Why couldn't the additional missions just be a fun thing for completionists to go after? The SpongeBob Movie feels like a game made in a rush, but because Battle for Bikini Bottom already existed and this game lifted so much straight from that, it was never going to be a complete disaster. It feels like the only reason this game had any good moments is because Battle for Bikini Bottom existed before it. Next time, I'll be looking at the final Nick game of 2004, a series of unfortunate events. This was the first time Nick had turned any of their live-action fictional content into a game, with Double Dare and Guts getting the treatment, but obviously those were based on game shows. I have absolutely zero attachment to this series, never read the books, never seen the film, and never seen the Netflix series. Despite that, I'm fascinated to see what will be served up in what is unquestionably a big moment in Nickelodeon video game history. To make sure you don't miss any of my upcoming reviews, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. And to stay up to date with everything that's happening with the channel, jump over to Twitter and give me a follow.